looking at the last bit of the poem, we start off with an architect could use all this, place layer over layer. And first of all, hopefully by now we know what this is. This is an indefinite article. So the noun that the article is referring to is architect. And it's not the architect, it's not this architect, it's an architect. So it's indefinite. We don't know who the architect is. And it doesn't matter, we don't really need to know. It's just an architect. When we think about this idea of architect, it's quite interesting that all the symbolism that this noun could represent. So an architect constructs buildings, and they do this by designing the structure of a building on paper. So constantly we're referring back to the paper, tissue, something vulnerable, but something that is the medium for so much. In this case, paper is referred to as something which an architect draws on in order to create bigger structures. For example, buildings, for example, capitals, like capital cities. We think of a capital city being full of buildings, monoliths, which are essentially stone structures, which have a lot of history to them. And we've also got a lot of references to what these buildings are made up of, again, brick or block. So think of this building, right? And we've had buildings being mentioned. And now we're actually going back to the roots of how these buildings were constructed, and we're going back to the architect who actually constructs these buildings, these railways, these roads. We've got roads mentioned. So it's almost as if Dharker is creating this idea of a building, right? And she mentions that building, and then she almost disassembles it, this idea of a building, right? So we've got this dismantling happening when she says, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away. And now imagine that building is falling away back to its roots, back to its bricks or blocks, and back even to the architect who began to construct it, who put that piece of paper down on his desk or her desk and actually drew out the outline of the very building that is being dismantled. It's like we're going back to the roots. So it's a very interesting mention of an architect as well, because an architect is someone who designs things. And in a way, this could very well be a metaphor as well. And remember, I've said this quite a few times, but there are many different interpretations for what is going on in this poem. So in one sense, it could be an architect of a building, but it could also be a metaphor for God. And a lot of people do kind of view God as a kind of architect for humanity, for the human race, for animals, for everything really. God is the original creator. In a sense, he is the original architect. He is the one who has created humanity. Now, when we look at the way that tissue is a metaphor or a representation, whatever you want to call it, for humanity, we can see how perhaps God could be this architect that is being referred to, and how the actual thing that is being built, that thing that is being constructed, much like an architect constructs buildings, is actually humanity. And we have made this kind of distinction between how each thing that is mentioned, each part of the poem, the paper, the religion, the buildings, the pages which have been transparent, even the maps or the grocery slips, the receipts, could all go back to this idea that humanity is behind it all. So in that sense, the architect could really very much represent God. And we think about the way that religion has been treated in this poem, and the way that religion has been mentioned very suddenly and very randomly. And we could actually link this to this idea that perhaps religion is at the core of the poem, that perhaps this poem is about the root of humanity being religion, and at the same time, the root of, I guess, the ugliness of humanity being religion. We are all separated by religion, but we're also at the same time unified by religion. It's many different reasons behind religion, and many different interpretations of religion, which could be all referred to in this poem. So an architect could use all this. Look at the way that, again, Dharker really repeats this word could or might. She really repeats the epistemic verbs. Again, really highlighting this idea of opinion. You know, it's not forceful. Her speaker, rather, is not forcing an opinion. It's not an architect must use all this. Look at the use of dialectic. This, we've got this, which is pointing at, I guess, the rest of the poem. So an architect could use all this. It could be the buildings, it could be the maps, it could be the fine slips of grocery shops, or it could be this pointing at the construction of, or the design of any building. It could be pointing at any building. It could be your house, my house, anything. This, though, the speaker is definitely pointing at something and referring to something. Place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line. Now, the first thing I'm going to point out is this repetition of over. And over is a preposition, and a preposition is essentially a word which signifies where something is. So over, under, next to, it's a preposition. So this repetition of the preposition over gives it a sense of direction, doesn't it? Place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers. We've got this kind of direction that things are over each other, that things are almost stacked upon each other. Just as, bricks are stacked on each other in order to construct a building, or just as words are stacked on each other in a religious text. When we look at a map, all these designs stacking on each other in order to show the layout of a place or a space. So there's this directional quality to the writing here. It's as if we're looking at it, isn't it? It's as if it's written for us, or as if we are viewing it firsthand, but we do get this deep sense of imagery, that things are stacked one on top of the other, and this layer over layer is definitely an important part of the poem. Now, we've talked a lot about how opinions layer over each other, haven't we? We've talked about how the poem itself layers opinions. We've got how the poem takes ideas and stacks them on each other. There's ideas of religion, there's ideas of death, there's ideas around travel, there's ideas even on the economy. You could say all these ideas are almost layered on each other in the poem, that we could take many different meanings and stack them on top of each other. Is religion good, or is it, that's meant to be a tick, or is it bad? What comes of religion? Does religion create unity? Or does it create separation? What about the economy? Does it create separation? Are we powerful, or are we fragile? What does death do to us? Does it link us to nature, or is nature going to separate us? Do you see what I mean here? I know my little mind map here is probably really confusing, but it really, I think, cements this idea of layer over layer, that Dharker is purposefully confusing us by creating stacks of opinions, one on top of each other. I like the idea of a mind map, actually, because we've got one topic which brings up another topic, which brings up another topic. We start off the poem with paper that lets the light shine through, which suggests that paper is vulnerable. But then we've got, this is what could alter things. So then paper has power. It has the power to alter things. It has the power to change things. So immediately we've got two layers. We've got this opinion that paper is vulnerable, and then immediately we've got this opinion that paper is powerful, and that's layered on each other. Interestingly enough, these opinions don't contrast each other. They just build upon each other until we've got this whole huge picture of humanity as something that is created with many different opinions. It's many different views, many different ideas shape humanity. So we've got layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line. We've got this idea again of luminosity, which links to light. And remember, we've got a huge semantic field or motif of light shining through paper. So again, this concept of luminosity, of something which is shining, right? And this luminosity is becoming the script, right? So slowly, light is actually becoming words. Right, so I've talked a little bit about the way that nature is kind of melding into paper, is melding into humanity. So, again, this idea of luminous script could very well, reflect the way that light of luminosity becomes words, which become human beings. Words are written by human beings, of course. Any script is constructed and created by a human being. Over numbers, over line. Again, we've got numbers, economy, this reference to the economy, numbers, over line. Think about the way this poem is constructed. We've got line upon line upon line. Art could be line. We could have line as in the line on a receipt. I don't know, I'm kind of reaching here, but a line could be any kind of sentence. It could be anything, really. And then, and never wish to build again with brick. So I've underline brick because I'm talking about the way that bricks layer each other. Bricks are referenced to when we think about buildings, we think about the disassembling or dismantling of the building, and it's when we separate a building apart, we find bricks or blocks. But also this idea of never wishing to build again with brick, that this architect whose whole livelihood, when we think of an architect, we think of someone who constructs buildings which are made up of bricks or blocks. But actually, this architect is kind of having their job changed into something a lot deeper, a lot more spiritual, a lot more meaningful. And this is why an architect could actually represent just the idea of constructing something or creating something. And that's why it could link very well to God, because this architect is deeper than just a simple job role. It's actually the representation of constructing things. And I guess what Dharker's speaker might be trying to say is that an architect might need to forget about these shallow constructions which are built up of brick or block and focus more on daylight breaking through the capitals and monolith. You know, we've got this idea that architects may never want to build again with brick or block, which represents buildings, but also represents kind of the shallowness of humanity. You know, we build, but these buildings are really fragile. We see this in the fourth stanza when Dharker says, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away. Now, this reminder that an architect is actually a creator reminds us again that buildings are actually paper and they are being dismantled, and that the architect or God might not want to build these shallow things which are so easily broken, which represent not just buildings, but shallow ideas. So the architect, the constructor, the person who creates, might want to forget about all these shallow things that we've talked about before, which create separation. Instead, this architect might want to let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. And again, we've got this concept of daylight, of nature breaking. Look at this verb, break, giving us the idea of something obviously breaking. And it's present tense, by the way, to break. This daylight is breaking through capitals and monoliths. And again, we've got this idea of capital cities, or monolith is a stone structure. So the daylight, this nature, is essentially breaking apart buildings and structures. And these capitals and monoliths, again, they're not just capitals and monoliths. They're layered. They represent deeper structures that humanity have created, that human beings have created, just as an architect creates. Humanity has created these structures like religion, like money, like the economy, but nature is breaking through these structures, through the shapes that pride can make. Again, this idea of pride, think about human pride, legacy. Why would a human being want to carry on tradition and carry on ideas? Because of legacy, because of pride, because we want to live forever through these structures that we create. We want to live forever, and that's why we create these family trees. It's essentially why we pass on religious concepts to each other, why things are passed on, why the economy has lived forever, why we teach our children to look after money, to make sure that we preserve our own wealth. And so this idea of pride actually breaks because it can't last forever. It's essentially fragile, and it's literally all made up of fragile paper anyway. So find a way to trace a grand design. So now we're getting into something a lot deeper. So Dharker has dismantled everything that is human, which humanity has created. She's broken it apart. She said that it's all down to human pride that it's carried on this long anyway. And she's allowing nature, daylight is a representation of nature, to break all that. And then she says, maybe humanity, or the architect, or God, or whoever this represents, this noun represents, could find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue. Raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. I want to add really quickly something that I missed before. And that is the verb let, but let the daylight break. And this verb has actually been used before in the first stanza when we see that paper that lets the light shine through. So this idea of the present tense verb lets, or let, being repeated again to signify a structure made up of bricks and blocks which let the daylight break through. So this kind of, I guess, passive verb, it's letting, it's allowing, it's not doing anything active, it's actually allowing the light to break through it and break it, this verb break, really dismantle it, is just repeated again as it was mentioned in the first stanza, paper that lets the light shine through. Immediately, this connects that paper which Dharker was talking about, paper that lets the light shine through. It connects this paper to these buildings, these capitals and monoliths. It's a clear connection that paper lets the light shine through, and so do these capitals and monoliths, so do these buildings, so do these constructs. And it's just another way of linking this fragile, small, thin paper to buildings. At the end of the day, these buildings are simply as fragile and as vulnerable to daylight or light breaking through them as paper is. And also, let's just look at this noun daylight. Now, in the first stanza, we just had paper that lets the light shine through. We didn't have daylight, it was just light. And now we've got daylight, which really, I mean, there's not so much difference. At the end of the day, light is light, but we definitely know that this is natural light, okay? It's not artificial light from a lamp, it's natural light coming from the sun. Now we have a mention of the sun shining through the maps and their borderlines, but this is definitely a reference to light in the day. It also makes us think about maybe a new morning or the sunrise, something which, comes at the beginning of the day, this idea of beginning. Think about the sun. That's meant to say beginning. That is meant to say beginning. Think about the sun rising and breaking through the darkness, breaking through the night. Think about fresh new beginnings. Think about something starting up again. This idea of daylight always coming and, nighttime always ending. Daylight breaking through capitals and monoliths. The sun coming up once again. This cyclical idea of light and night and nature. Look at the way that all these different ideas are structured on the page, right? Look at the way that these ideas are presented. It looks messy, but it's also many different ideas all stemming from this one poem. And I definitely think that this is how we need to be analysing tissue. We need to be taking all these ideas and layering them and contrasting them and kind of getting this big old mind map out, right? Where one word could mean many different things. Look at architect. Architect could be God. Architect could be a human architect. Architect could be anyone who puts pen to paper. It doesn't matter. The fact is that this one noun, architect, has many different meanings to it. Same with the epistemic verb next to it. We've got could. What does this represent? What does this tell us about the poem at hand? And then what does the poem at hand tell us about humanity? I just wanted to add this point because looking back over my notes and the way that I've written it, I can see how confusing it may be and how it may look. And I've said this a couple of times before, but just want to add that it is hard when we have a poem like this with many, many different interpretations, meanings to it. We can take one small stanza or even one small line and get a lot out of it. And that is the point of the poem, that it's meant to be representing that about humanity itself, that humanity doesn't just mean one thing, it means many different things. And that, I think, is what the crux of the poem is. And that's what I'm showing you here with this little mind map, with all these notes written down, all these ideas which we can get from just 2 stanzas. And we've got so many different ideas. So yeah, definitely would recommend when you're doing your notes to do it in this mind map form and really be creative with it and try and get as many interpretations as you can, even from one sentence or one stanza or even one word. We're going to be focusing on the last 2 stanzas of the poem, probably the most important stanzas in order to get clarity over what Dharker could be saying. It's definitely this idea of a climax, or as if the poem is kind of building up to this moment where we get this kind of last stanza, and we've talked a bit about it in the context video, so if you want to refer to that to get more clarity over why, or perhaps some reasons why the poem ends in one sentence. But it definitely gives a sense of climax, this idea that the poem is building up to something. We've got this standard 4 lines per stanza throughout the whole poem, and then this one line really stands out and kind of gives us the sense that actually it's this simple. At the end of the day, the poem is about humanity, but the build-up, the eventual climax of the poem ends in one simple sentence, which is ultimately addressing the reader. We've got this personal pronoun, your. Dharker speaker is talking to the reader here. Previously, we have I, we have that personal pronoun, but that I turns into your, and this direct address really stands out and I guess in a way, really solidifies this idea that the speaker is perhaps chatting to the reader, right? We've got your as in a direct address to the reader. So perhaps the speaker feels that she is kind of having a conversation, and that definitely accounts for the informal, spontaneous tone of the poem. Lines flow into each other. There's a topic that the speaker seems to think of and she adds on. Think about maps to, this adverb added on to, just after. It's like this idea of suddenness, as if a sudden thought has come up in the speaker's mind. It all builds up to this direct address towards the reader, and all of a sudden we realize that actually we're being pulled into the poem. We are human beings, and therefore we are a part of this poem, turned into your skin at the end. So yeah, let me just read it out. So, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make. Remember, we talk about pride as something which could account for human legacy. Think about why we write on paper. Think about the reasons behind inscribing things on paper. It's all down to memory. It's all down to being remembered. It's all down to understanding that we as humans are fragile, and therefore our pride doesn't let us just die out. We have to last forever in memory, pass on tradition. The structures that we create are as fragile as the paper that we write on. It's also as fragile as us, right? These papers, these tissues, these fragile things that we write on in order to create structures, all go down to us, what we value. And this definitely links back. In fact, this is the first time that Dharker has even mentioned tissue. And we can really connect this to the title. Remember, at the beginning, we've got the title, and then we've got this kind of definition of what the title is, and it's paper that lets the light shine through. Remember that. So we remember this. This was the very first sentence of the poem. And now we go back to tissue, although in this case, the tissue is kind of accentuated by this adjective with living tissue. So this adjective living gives this initial definition that we had of tissue, which is paper that lets the light shine through, more depth, right? And we understand that now Dharker has taken this idea of tissue, which was once paper that lets the light shine through, and linked it to actual living tissue. And we talk about the meaning of tissue. What could tissue mean? And in one sense, tissue is paper. Tissue is the paper that we write on in order to be remembered, to have a legacy, to create structures. Tissue or paper is everything around us, but it's also within us. We are formed of tissue. We are formed up of skin tissue, cell tissue, our organs are made of tissue. So we are tissue, and at the same time, tissue is around us. We're formed of many, many tissue cells which make up who we are. Does that make sense? So there's this idea I talked about in the previous frame of being dismantled. And remember, I talked about the way that buildings can be dismantled backwards to an architect sitting down and designing that building on paper, right? Which we have established many times that paper is compared to tissue, because tissue is the definition of paper which lets the light shine through. Just as that building is dismantled to simple fragile tissue, human beings can be dismantled to basically represent something as fragile as tissue. So there's many meanings behind that word tissue, and the crux of it is that we are all formed of this fragile, breakable, vulnerable, translucent, transparent paper. We are nothing but fragile. That's what we are. That's what our structures are. That's what our legacy is. There we go. With living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last. Again, really kind of highlighting what I just said. We've got this grand design with living tissue, so it's seemingly grand. We've got this adjective grand, and design as well. Think about the way that an architect designs buildings. Think about the way that we design our legacy. We want to carry it on forward. Think about the way that an architect designs a building. It's all very purposeful. There's this idea of purpose behind it. When we design something, we do it with the means of creating something very specific, right? So then again, this idea of grand design can link very much to this sense of God, that perhaps we as human beings have been designed for a higher purpose. But what have we been designed so grandly for? Well, we have been raised and designed to never last. right? And this adverb never is so strong. We've got this sense of strength behind the word never, right? And that's an adverb. We are never meant to last, just as the buildings that the architect creates is never meant to last. And remember that fourth stanza, the buildings are falling away on a drift towards the wind. We ourselves always fall away. We are never meant to last. We can compare ourselves to these buildings, to these structures, to these economies that we create, but essentially, just as fragile as they are, that's how fragile we are. So we are these structures. And Dharker almost dehumanizes us. Think about the way she kind of calls humanity living tissue. Yes, there's this adjective living, but we're essentially disembodied. We're essentially just reduced to something simple, right? We're as simple as tissue. We're not complex. We're just living tissue. And we're dehumanized here. We're a structure, right? We're not people. We're not human beings. We're just structures. And think about the way that, if you've watched the context video, think about the way that Dharker talks about humanity in that quote, where she says that, you know, everyone is split up, everyone's split up into religious sects, and there's no unity anymore. Well, structure kind of has these connotations, yes, of being dehumanized, but also this kind of deliberate sense of putting different parts together to create one thing. There's definitely, I think, ideas of unification or unity behind structure. Think about the way that design makes us think about purpose. So this idea that human beings were created for a purpose, created to be unified, and also this idea of living tissue being combined to create, to raise this structure. There's this definite sense that we are simply all human beings at the end of the day. We're not Muslim, we're not Hindu, we're not Christian, we're not separate, we're not people who are rich, people who are poor. We are, at the end of the day, human beings, just made up of living tissue. We're almost reduced, we're dismantled, and then we're raised, we're kind of reshaped into a new structure, one that is never meant to last. We will all die. So again, these last 3 lines, I thought I didn't want to clutter the page too much, so let's have a look at the sibilants, which really strikes out here in these last 2 stanzas especially. So we've got structure, never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked, and then we've got this change from sibilants to assonance. So this T sound comes out, thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. And we've talked a little bit about the way that the poem ends with this S sound. It ends with a sort of hissing sound. So once again, we've got this kind of sibilance interrupted by assonance. You can see it here. We've got the S, 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 and all of a sudden it's interrupted, right? That S sound disappears for a bit in this line, especially thinned to be transparent. This T sound, turned, also shows up. It interrupts the kind of pace that we had going on, and then at the end we've got the sibilants once again with skin. So it kind of ends with that hissing sound. It ends with that S sound that we are so used to throughout the poem. But again, this interruption could definitely represent this idea of opinions being interrupted. This idea that we have long held opinions. We're used to this sibilance, right? And even, you know, if you actually look at the poem as a whole and pick out all the sibilants in the poem, there's so much of it. There's so much of this hissing sound. There's so much of this S sound. We're used to it. And all of a sudden, we get interrupted here by this sudden change, right? And that's the only way I can really describe it. It's a change of sound. It's the change in your mouth when you're reading it out loud. It's I've said it a million times, but it's interrupted. And I think this idea of being interrupted, or this new idea which has been brought about, definitely goes hand in hand with this sudden introduction of living tissue. Previously in the poem, we've talked about the idea of tissue being paper, right? We've talked about tissue being a representation of the Quran, of buildings, of maps, of money, and so on and so forth. These are the more kind of obvious ways that tissue or paper has been kind of represented, but there are also a lot of subtle ways that paper represents kind of ideas or structures that human beings have created. And now all of a sudden we've got this change. We've got this we go from paper being, well, paper to paper being human tissue, right? It's as if Dharker's speaker is saying, yeah, hold on, we're talking about human beings here. We're talking about what human beings are made up of, first and foremost. That's the most important thing. And a sudden interruption where we go from tissue being paper to tissue being human, right? It's sudden, it's jarring, it's random almost. It's this introduction of a new idea, and this introduction of a new idea, I think, is meant to be jarring. It's meant to kind of stir you or shake you, right? It's meant to make you think, actually, this is a new point. It's a different point. It's like I said, it's a climax, but it's also something new, something different. It's something that is something we're not used to reading about, right? It's kind of like an addition. It's kind of like introducing, I guess, the main point. So different from the symbolism and the extended metaphor in the rest of the poem. So this idea of introducing something, interrupting long-held opinions, we've talked a little bit about this and how this could really represent the idea of human beings all carrying different opinions, of layering these different opinions upon each other, or contradicting each other with these different opinions. And we talked a bit about the way that conflict works and how does discrimination and racial bias or kind of separation work, and that separation really stems from human beings having different opinions, having conflicting opinions. So I think this idea of conflict of opinion is definitely represented throughout the whole poem in different ways, from the way that sound changes to the way that this climax works, to the way that even the way that Dharker uses words, and she uses a lot of different adjectives which jar us and shake us. Think about the adjective living, and then think about the adverb never. In never meant to last, we've got these strong words which kind of almost contradict each other. Living and never. You know, living has very positive connotations and never is very solid, like no, never meant to last. Moving on, by the way, we've got this kind of repetition of and. Remember, and is a conjunction. Look at the way that and is repeated. It elongates the sentence, and think about the way the imagery that's being created here of paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent. Think of the way that Dharker creates this kind of image in our heads of paper being smoothed out, almost rolled out like flour, being thinned out and almost battered in a way to be transparent, to be see-through. That in that same way, the repetition of and is really spreading out the sentence. And again, this word transparent, which I think is repeated a couple of times in the poem. And the connotations of this adjective are really that, you know, again, see-through, light shines through. There's this constant reminder that light or daylight or the sun is always shining through these human structures, even shining through our own skin. Our own skin is like smoothed out and stroked out and kind of becoming transparent and see-through. There's this real imagery that's being created of human skin being linked with human structures, being linked to nature and almost becoming a part of nature. And then this last line, which I've talked about many, many times now, turned into your skin. So this personal pronoun, the reader is being brought into it. And this idea of turned, which really reflects transformation, right? And we've talked about the way that opinions are layered on each other, they conflict each other, they go against each other, they've been piled onto each other until the poem itself becomes confusing. What is it about? This verb, turned, really, I think, cements this idea of transformation. One idea has been transformed into another one. A new idea has been brought into the poem. And that is that essentially everything that this poem is talking about is about you. It's about you or me or anyone who's reading the poem. Every subject that Dharker has brought into this poem is essentially a reflection of you, of me, of humanity. And that's why I think the topic of humanity is so important in explaining and clarifying what the poem is about, because essentially the poem is about our opinions, our ideas, our legacy, what we leave behind, but most importantly, it's about us. So just briefly, this last stanza or line of the poem, turned into your skin, I just want to focus on this idea of your skin especially. So human tissue being thinned and turned, this idea of humans dying, transforming into nature, we decompose into soil, we eventually become a part of nature, and there's this cyclical element, this cycle element that we die, we're reborn, we die, we're reborn, right? And in that process, we attempt to leave a legacy behind, but it doesn't always last, just as we don't always last, the things we leave behind don't always last. But I want to also talk about the impact of having the poem end on this word skin, and I've talked a bit about the way that it sounds, really kind of harsh or kind of sour word. It makes us think about ourselves as disembodied. it gives us this disembodied idea, doesn't it? Because think about it, it doesn't end on turned into you, it ends in turned into your skin. There's this idea of maybe being dismantled until all that's left of us as human beings is our skin, right? It's this real bodily aspect, right? It ends on skin. It's about our skin. It's not necessarily about us, our brains, our ideas, our legacy. At the end of the day, it's almost as if Dharker has ended the poem on skin, because she wants to force us to think about ourselves as bodies, right? As just skin and flesh. She doesn't want us to think about ourselves as brains, as ideas, as concepts, as metaphors. We aren't the things we leave behind. The things we leave behind perish. So we are just skin at the end of the day. And I definitely think there's an idea in the poem that's being built up, that the things we value, the things that we leave behind, the things that we fight each other over, these opinions and ideas that we leave behind, or these legacies that we leave behind, they don't matter, right? What matters at the end of the day is who we are, what we are made up of, and that we are all at the end of the day composed of skin. The skin is one thing that makes us universal, that we all have skin, we all have organs, we're all made up of tissue. Lastly, I just want to stress that I think the idea of skin is incredibly important when we consider this idea of the use of the Quran in the poem. Think about ideas around discrimination. Think about Dharker herself, who was born and brought up kind of in Glasgow as a minority, right? Think about the way that skin unifies us. It's something we all have, but it also separates us, doesn't it? The way that skin colour works, the way that racism works, the way that discrimination works, the way that humans judge each other. Skin. And the importance of skin being something that is, after all, external. It's the first thing we see. It's our skin colour that's the first thing that we look at. And it's something so shallow, but also something so separating and defining. This idea of tissue being a universal thing, turning into your skin, which is also a universal thing. It's just an interesting noun to end the poem on. This skin, which puts us together, which makes us human beings. Human beings all have skin, but also separates us as well. It's a shallow thing, right? But it's also one that is so deep-rooted and so important in the way that we operate, in the way that we react to each other. It's just an incredibly interesting word, incredibly interesting noun to end on. Just lastly, this idea of the sentence ending in turned into your skin. I want to focus on this verb turned, where we've got this idea of tissue becoming skin. We have talked about the different things that tissue could represent, and one of the things that tissue could represent is actual tissue paper, right? Man-made, isn't it? Paper, tissue paper, it's fragile, but it's man-made. It's not organic, it's not natural, right? Skin, however, on the other hand, is organic. It's not man-made, it's what we're composed of. So this interesting thing of something being man-made, right? In one sense, that tissue could be man-made, it could be made up of in a factory by human beings, turning into something organic, something that we all have, something that we were born with. It's not man-made, it's something that we have, like constructed tissue, becoming something organic like skin. I think it really adds to this overall idea of human creation versus human tissue, right? The tissue in the sense of the paper is a human creation, and skin is composed of human tissue. So yeah, it's super deep, this idea of transformation, this idea of things that are man-made becoming organic, becoming a part of nature in a way, and skin itself is naturally able to decompose and become one with the soil, one with nature. It really makes you think about priorities, and again, it really dismantles the human body and it dismantles ideas constructed by human beings themselves. This concept and idea of breaking things apart, even the human body apart, until it becomes nothing, right? Ideas become nothing, the body becomes nothing, and everything just eventually all gets down and becomes a part of nature.